we need to recognize that power does not just exist in the government. Now, the founders knew that, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But we have forgotten that there are all kinds of levels of power in the society. And if you're obsessed just with government power, you will forget that actually it is these outside forces, these non-governmental powers, that are really meant to check the power of the government itself. Yes, the branches of the government are great and the checks and balances. Yes, these are all good, right? We want to separate those powers, of course. But that is not sufficient to actually hold government power at bay. Because once all the power is pushed up into government, then those little ideas about separating the powers and checking and balancing each other, they start to break down because they're not sufficient to a powerful government that has really brought all of society's authority unto itself, right? And this means that all the abuse can just occur at a higher level. And this is the classic, what's called the Odysseus problem, right? The desire to bind authority. Can you ultimately bind sovereignty, or is sovereignty ultimately always going to have that final say, that final exercise of power? And that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about today. So when we think about these different types of power, these different social spheres, I want to talk to you a little bit about Bertrand de Jouvenel. If you're playing your Auron bingo card at home, you can check the Bertrand de Jouvenel box off for today. And Bertrand de Jouvenel is this French philosopher who talks about the metaphysics of power. And one of the things that de Jouvenel says is that the only thing that's ever really stopped power is opposing power. Once again, I'll remind you, that's not just his creation. That's something that our founders knew as well. That's why they set power against power. But de Jouvenel wants to zoom out and say it's not just the government power that we need to think about. It's the other social spheres, the spheres of church, the spheres of family, the spheres of community, tribe. These are the things that actually control the different powers and balance each other inside your society. And the government just becomes one of these many spheres of power. So yes, you have state authority, but you have church authority, you have religious authority, you have family authority, you have the authority of community and tribe. And each one of these has different interests. The power of family is different from the power of community, which is different from the power of church, which is different from the power of the state. And so the way that they hold these powers, the way that they engender their loyalties, the way that they push back against each other, these things are all unique. And because the power is unique and comes from different places that are critical to your society, each sphere can only ask for so much. The church can only ask for so much. The family can only ask for so much. The tribe can only ask for so much. The state can only ask for so much. Because if any one of those asks for too much, the other critical pillar of society will start to crumble. If you ask for too much in the state, then the family's going to start to crumble. The tribe is going to start to crumble. If the church asks for too much, then the family might crumble. If any one of these demands too much of the individual, then the entire society starts to come apart because they were interconnected and essential on levels. The government was not just the be-all and end-all of communal authority. And that's what we need to understand. Today, we have this really, really atomistic relationship with the state. We as individuals interact with this Leviathan state. And this is why you see movies like Brazil or stories like 1984 and these people trying to overcome these insane technocratic bureaucracies and just failing at every level, right? Because they, as an individual, even though they might know something's wrong, they might recognize errors in the system, they might wish to be, something else, they as one person cannot push away from the state. They simply do not have enough power. Collective forces are the only thing that actually push back against state power. But if you eliminate all these collective forces, then you end up a scenario where you don't have the ability to push back. This is really important because a lot of conservatives will frame right and left battles, conservative and liberal battles, in the idea of individualism versus collectivism. And that is dumb. That is very dumb. Okay. Yes, there are parts of leftism that are toxic collectiveness, right? The communism and these other things, not helpful. However, collective action is the only thing that ever gets anything done, including making governments smaller. And this is unfortunately why libertarians often fail in their quest to make governments smaller, because they don't understand this. They think it's all individualism. We're individual libertarians, right? So we all have our own notion of what libertarian is. This is the problem with libertarians. You get 10 of them in a room and everyone will tell you that the other ones don't believe in real libertarianism, but they do, right? Because they have their real libertarianism. So it's very difficult for the libertarians to collectivize and push back against power because every one of them is trying to define their own special plan. And even though they all know they're in opposition to the government at large, it's very difficult for them to then collectively push back against it, right? So this is a huge issue. Now, one of the things that guys like Alexis de Tocqueville realized was that ultimately it is the voluntary associations in the United States that allowed our government to be small. He pointed out that it was the social clubs and the churches and the fraternal organizations and the fire departments and like all of these things that Americans were constantly volunteering for. They became kind of their own little power centers, right? You might think of the fire brigade is no big deal, the voluntary fire brigade, until you realize that several influential men of the city are involved in the fire brigade. And actually being a part of the fire brigade means you have a certain level of cachet and influence inside and access to power through that. And you have access to the power through the fire brigade in a way you don't have it if you just go straight to, say, the government. And so this fire brigade acts as kind of like its own ad hoc little check against government power, because it's not just the government that has the power, it's also this fire brigade. The same is true of church, of course. Church should primarily be a place where you worship God, but you're naturally going to grow connections there. And everyone knew through most of American history that if you wanted to make valuable social connections, you would go to church because that's where you met people of influence inside the town in settings that weren't necessarily, again, official government functions. And every time you have these voluntary associations, you're creating basically little cabals inside your community. We used to call this the old boys network. Now, that's a dirty word today because, again, we have this idea that anyone doing having power outside official government operations is bad, right? But not necessarily. Actually, this is what created those pushback against the state controlling all the power, because of course, never did any one of these voluntary associations have all the power. Yes, you had the church, but you also had the fire brigade, and you had your fraternal organization, and you had your community organization, your Rotary Club. All of these things were involuntary associations that created spheres of power that could influence government, but were not part of government. And they pushed back against the idea that all your effort needed to be in influencing, controlling the operation of the state itself. They also took on a lot of duties that the state would later take on. So if the state is feeding you and putting out all your fires and personally responsible for your protection and responsible for the education of your children and responsible for your health care and everything, well, then the state has all of the eggs in its basket, right? There's nothing that these other organizations can do for you that the state can't do. But that wasn't available through most of history. There wasn't this level of scale and infrastructure that allowed the state to provide all those things. So it had to rely on churches. It had to rely on fraternal organizations. It had to have voluntary fire brigades because it couldn't fund a military throughout most of history, much less individual police forces and fire brigades. In a lot of America, you didn't even have the office of sheriff because it was seen as an abusive office from England. Instead, you had a constable, and if the constable wanted to make an arrest, he didn't even go to arrest the person by himself. He had to go to the men of the city and convince them that this guy needed to be arrested, and then he would go with basically a mob to arrest that person. And that was the way that policing was done, in that it was a community thing. Every man had to be involved. You had to compel these different people, these private citizens, into public action. And that meant that the office was not really something that you could easily abuse, right? This is how you avoided an abuse of power. It's not by just dividing the sheriff's power up. No, instead, you had a system where the average person had to be directly involved in the action. It wasn't just the state separate. No, if you wanted to make this arrest, you needed to bring the rest of the community in and utilize them in order to make that happen. But of course, it's not just the voluntary associations, right? It's also the involuntary associations. In fact, in many ways, the involuntary associations are even more important. I can't break the bonds of family. I can't break the bonds of religion that I was born into. As easily as I can just leave my, loyalty to Walmart or, some job I'm working at. Like those voluntary associations, those, the blood and the religion and the tradition and the heritage, those things are far more difficult to simply leave behind and break and betray than all these, voluntary associations of market and commerce and even loyalty to the state, right? And these things are critical because when you have these associations, they are so deeply ingrained in human nature, and more importantly, so ingrained in human existence, like they are necessary for human flourishing, that it's very difficult for people to abandon them for some benefit from the state or someone else, right? And this is what really ends up binding government power. Yes, again, constitution, division of power, all great, right? But ultimately, it is truly the loyalty to these non-voluntary associations and voluntary associations that ultimately is what really restricts the state. And it's not just me saying that. That's what Alexis de Tocqueville said. That is what Bertrand de Jouvenel said. We have a long history of Frenchmen telling Americans about how America works, but nonetheless, these parts are true.